The Philadelphia Eagles dismantled the Kansas City Chiefs' attempt at a three-peat. What can the Bengals take away from Super Bowl 59? Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien, and we are Locked On Bengals on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're new, you don't know it, we're on YouTube. We're everywhere you get your podcast. So wherever you'd like to catch your latest Bengals news, look for Locked On Bengals, and we'll be there for you. All the everydayers know it. All of those of you who make us your first listen know it. We appreciate all of you who make Locked On Bengals part of their daily routine. And James, yesterday we talked about what the Bengals can take away from both Super Bowl teams in terms of how they got there, in terms of roster construction. And there will be some of that in this episode as well. It will inevitably come up when we talk about how the game went and what the ultimate lessons are from the ultimate game of the season, as 2024 is now officially over. But as we look at that game, maybe the Eagles are just a super team. And I do think that their 2024 team will be hard for anyone else in the NFL to replicate. But that being said, if you listen to yesterday's episode, you know that there's a lot that we think is enviable and emulatable in the way that the Philly team put themselves together.
Yeah, so much of it. I think a lot of people are focused on the trenches, and rightfully so. We could talk about that. We could talk about the fact that everyone's focused on the trenches, and they paid 2 stud receivers and a stud tight end and a running back. I mean, they paid all of the skill players that don't matter to people because all those are luxury items. It's just a really well-built team. And it's so funny because we did that show on Sunday before the game, and we said, oh, they're the more talented team. They're more talented than the Chiefs. They're more complete, but you don't want to count out Mahomes and Reed and an elite coaching staff for the Chiefs, along with, I think a lot of people assume is going to be the top quarterback of this generation, and Patrick Mahomes. And I think some might be questioning that right now. But the point is which one wins? And the Eagles just overwhelmed the Chiefs with their talent at every point. I mean, Jahan Dotson, and this is where I want to start because I think it's so interesting how the Eagles overcome their mistakes, because the Bengals are going to probably have some mistakes. Jahan Dotson was a mistake for the Eagles. They traded for him right before the season. He was going to be their wide receiver 3. He made the big play that set up the first touchdown of the game. Their mistake did. And I think that's what's so interesting with the Eagles is it's not like they've been perfect. They've gotten it wrong with free agent signings, with first-round draft picks, with the wrong receiver and Jalen Reagor in the first round. And they don't let that completely derail them. And in that, to me, stands out a lot. But, yeah, I think that the main takeaway is just going to be how talented of a roster that Eagles team has and had this season.
And how can other teams aspire to that? When you look at the Eagles offense, and we'll start on the offense. We'll talk about the defense as well.
Sure.
The defense is mostly a triumph of drafting. When you look at the way that defense came together, there's more to it than that. And there's some of that on the offense too. But on the offense, these are the positions that they're paying a lot of money to. Wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, left tackle, right tackle, tight end, quarterback, running back. That's 7 out of your 11 starters on offense, which they were also like entirely healthy, which is remarkable on the offensive side of the ball, at least for starters. They lost some guys on defense. They lost Jack Driscoll at some point on offense as well. But starting 5 offensive linemen for the year, they're paying 2 elite tackles. They're paying a top of market receiver, a secondary top of market receiver, a top of market tight end, top of market quarterback, top of market running back. And the running back market is depressed. So maybe that doesn't mean much. But when you spell it out like that, and then you think about Duke Tobin saying, how many players can we pay at the top of their position?
Well, there's a pie.
There's a pie. There's an apple. And then you look at the Eagles.
You grind up that apple and you make apple pie, and it's unlimited pie for everybody if you do it right. That's what the Eagles
And it's
do.
not unlimited forever. To be like the Eagles will pay a price for this in the future. But
Sure.
this goes back to what we were talking about before the show. When you have a chance to win and you stay aggressive and creative in maximizing your roster, you eventually can get, like, this is the optimal outcome of that approach. Is this Eagles team that I'm literally thinking, like, is this a replicable team? Is this just a super team that no other NFL team can aspire to? Or it's like once every 10 years, you actually get it together and you look back in hindsight, you're like, man, how did the NFL let the Eagles pile up talent like A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith and Milton Williams and Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith and Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean on the same team?
Mm.
You know?
Yeah. All guys that at one point or another, especially not Carter, because the Bengals never had a shot at him, but literally Milton Williams, Cooper DeJean, Quinyon Mitchell, all guys we talked about pre-draft. Like it's not like they have some hidden crystal ball. They know what their weaknesses are. They attack them, and they're willing to be flexible in their approach. And I think that's it, is being willing to pivot, being willing to move, being willing to aggressively address your weaknesses. A.J. Brown wasn't this 1,400-yard receiver when they gave up a first rounder to get him. Now, he was awesome. I think Bengals fans know it firsthand from the playoff game in the divisional round for the Titans. And it was a questionable decision from the jump. But it's not like he was 1,400 plus every season. And so aggressively addressing your weaknesses, I think that's a big part of it. And when you get it wrong, i.e. Sheldon Rankins, all right, not only move on, but go get it right. And I think it's going to take some luck along the way to build the Jalen Carter defensive front. I'm not sure they're going to be able to necessarily do that, but they don't have to. They just have to get better there. And I think that's the main key is be much better from a pass rush standpoint.
Yeah, and take those risks and keep trying. Don't sit on your hands at any point. Constantly look for ways to upgrade your team.
For example, the Bengals, they kind of made their free agent flurry last year, and then they were kind of done. And there were some obvious needs that they had on defense. Questions at corner, questions at defensive tackle. And are they going to get enough pressure? Are they really set up at the edge to get enough pressure? And it's one of those things where they could have added another guard. They could have added another defensive tackle. And so that's something to keep in mind as they add pieces and as this offseason unfolds.
Which are both spots we thought they were going to make one more move. And we thought that's what the money told us. We thought that's what the visits told us. We thought that's what the roster told us. And then they didn't make that one more move. Another thing here, James, and this is much more hot takey, is the team that traded for a wide receiver won the Super Bowl. The team that traded away its wide receiver lost the Super Bowl. And
I don't think that's takey. I think that's ideal.
There
were
some issues for the Chiefs throwing the ball in this game. Yes, there were pressure issues. Mahomes was seeing ghosts and was pulling the ball down, running face first into sacks a couple of times in this game. But the disparity in weapons in this game, I mean, in the trenches too, don't get me wrong. And the trenches are a huge reason the Eagles won this game, but the Eagles were just a complete team, which is paying so many positions and has all these draft hits. We can talk about the other side of this too, though, and the receiver ideas, this idea that you can go zero receiver and win against really good teams. I don't think you can quite go zero receiver. And that could be another takeaway from this game. Let's continue the conversation there coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks. Football season may be over, but basketball is in full swing. And there's no better way to stay in the game than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With PrizePicks, you can pick more or less in at least 2-player projections. And if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. For example, let's say you're looking at Jason Tatum for more than 29 points. Well, you can do that. And you could combine that with Luka Doncic and his Lakers debut late on Monday night. Could go that route as well. They also have weekly promos like Taco Tuesday where you get discounted player projections for even better value. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game.
Your favorite topic, James?
Let's do it. It's so funny because over the past 3 years, it's been very clear that the Chiefs offense had been searching, and they won in spite of. But they'd been searching at wide receiver. They've tried all these experiments. They bring in DeAndre Hopkins, who with a stone cold drop in the first half with the game still remotely close. And they do all these things. They throw all these assets. You remember Sky Moore? Sky Moore was a guy that they were drafting to help replace Tyreek Hill. Mecole Hardman was a guy that was drafted to replace Tyreek Hill. And then they go and they get Xavier Worthy, who was pretty good yesterday in the Super Bowl. But the point is like they've thrown all these assets. It's very Bengal-like, where they lose this high-end player, and it's proof that it's hard to replace them, even if you're a smart team, even if you're a team that's willing to make trades and be aggressive. It's hard to replace the receiver. Now, what they did is they used that money on Joe Thuney and franchise tagging Orlando Brown Jr. and all of these things in the trenches. I get it, and it worked. They won 2 Super Bowls, but they still had never completely filled that void. And there was always a question mark at wide receiver. Kadarius Toney was another trade, by the way. And so they had dumped all these resources, and it's proof, like, this idea that the Bengals can just grab someone to plug in at wide receiver 2, I don't necessarily buy that because of how valuable, how important wide receiver 2 is in this offense.
And the Bengals have gotten it right at wide receiver quite a bit in their history. They've also gotten it wrong a few times.
It's been a while.
They've made life pretty tough on themselves a few times too. I mean, T. Higgins and Jamar Chase aren't that long ago. Not that Jamar was a hard decision, obviously, but they got T. Higgins right in the second round, and now they're dealing with that decision to draft or sign a replacement or bring him back. But what did you mean by been a while?
I mean, 4 years is there are seniors in high school that just graduated, right? You know, like it's a while from that perspective.
Gotcha.
And this is the team that drafted Jermaine Burton, who they cannot bank on going into this year.
Yeah.
I think everybody agrees.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard when you have a player with a particular skill set to replace that particular skill set. And Tyreek Hill had a fairly unique skill set, right? And Xavier Worthy does some of that for the Chiefs. But the thing that kind of helped keep them afloat is that they had this really good interior offensive line and this great coaching staff. And Travis Kelce, until this year, and even at times this year, was a premier weapon in that offense. And the premier weapon in that offense. And this year in the Super Bowl, he looked particularly, let's just say, stiff at times, to be kind. But even then, he still made a few plays. But overall, a rough day for that Chiefs offense. And then you talk about the offensive line with the Chiefs and the difficulty in sustaining a offensive line that can deal with elite pass rushing and elite game planning in the playoffs. The Eagles didn't blitz once in that entire game.
Yep.
I mean, they maybe ran some replacement pressure. Zach Bond had a few pass rushes. He's a linebacker. He's not on the pass rushing unit anymore. So they dropped some guys and sent Zach Bond a few times in that game. But by all the stats that you've seen, 0 blitzes. And Patrick Mahomes was under pressure like 45% of the time and wilted under that pressure. And so you got to have guys that can uncover quickly. You got to be able to get to those play calls. And the Eagles are uniquely built. And we just talked about how good their rookie corners are and how good their pass rush is and how they built that through the draft by identifying and aggressively tackling those needs and hammering the trenches over and over and over when they already had good players there, to the point where there are 2 Eagles defensive lineman players we're going to be talking about as free agent targets for the Bengals that both made huge plays in this game. And for the Chiefs, you're dealing with Joe Thuney having to play tackle because they haven't been able to figure out left tackle since Orlando Brown's departure. And Jawan Taylor's getting beat up in this game by Josh Sweat. And Mike Caliendo at left guard is getting beat up by pretty much every defensive tackle on the Eagles roster. And you just can't. Turns out win Super Bowls like that. The couple of times Patrick Mahomes has gotten to a Super Bowl for all of his talents and for all of the skill on that Kansas City team and all of that they overcome in making the plays they needed to win games this year. Very similar to the other Super Bowl Patrick Mahomes lost against Tampa Bay and Tom Brady, where and Gronk talked about it during the broadcast and Tom Brady talked about it during the broadcast. You can't block. Your offense is going to look pretty bad.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the thing that's most interesting, and I'm thinking about the best way to phrase it, but Mahomes isn't used to life like that. He's just not. And he's been good at hiding it a bit, but the ghost element of it, I mean, he was pretty shaken there early in the first half. I mean, that second interception was just awful. And I know he was getting hit a little bit, didn't get enough on it, but I think Zach Bond catches that regardless. He's just right there. And in the way he was moving, the way he was kind of spinning around and stuff, I know a lot of Bengals fans were like, yeah, that's what Joe deals with. And I wouldn't go that far. But I think it's really hard to fall behind and then have a pass rush that is able to wreak havoc like that and not have the game-changing weapons. Like, it's all of them. And like, I think Joe is used to it much more than Pat. Pat hasn't had to deal with that at that level, down by that amount of points in this pass first style. I mean, they weren't, you're right. They weren't blitzing anyone. I think that's such a factor. It's not like you could be like, all right, well, let's run screens here. Let's run quick game. It's hard to run quick game when there's 7 in coverage and you're still getting pressured and you don't have an elite go-to guy on the outside. And so I think it's a mixture there. I do think, though, and the Bengals, what's interesting is I think the Bengals know this. Like, going to get Sheldon Rankins, it's laughable now, but I think they really wanted to get some interior pressure along with Trey Hendrickson. And that makes a world of difference in games like that when you're trying to pressure an elite quarterback and get him off of his spot and get him out of rhythm.
And if all Sheldon Rankins needed to be for the Bengals was a situational pass rusher, he might have been okay at that role, but that's not what they asked him to do.
Well, no doubt. And that's a factor for sure. They said, come in and be this guy that's going to play all the time, and you're 30 and you've had your injury history, and it's tough. And so clearly, if you can add levels and layers to this pass rush, it would do wonders. At the same time, I do think that the way Mahomes played, isn't it? And not that we're talking about, but like, I think Joe would have handled that better than Mahomes did. I think Joe would have played better than Mahomes did. We'll never know. It's a hypothetical. But I do think that from a quarterback standpoint, it's like, yeah, we've seen Joe have to deal with that. And he finds answers. And the Chiefs, with Mahomes, with Andy Reid, with everything that they have from a coaching staff standpoint, all the things that we said before the Super Bowl in our last show, they could not figure it out. And they didn't score until it was garbage time. And yeah, the score looks closer than it was. It was not close, as everyone knows. And I do think that that's an indictment of how the Chiefs, how their stars are. And by stars, I mean Andy Reid, the guy I would consider the best coach in football, and Pat Mahomes, a lot of people think is the best quarterback in football.
Yeah, it's a lot to overcome when there's that much talent on one side. I don't know who's beating the Eagles in that Super Bowl. I don't know if there's a team that really stands up to them. There are teams that probably play them differently or in a different kind of outcome than we saw from the Chiefs, where that, in retrospect, and again, hindsight's always 2020, looked like a terrible matchup for the Chiefs. Mm-hmm. And so, again, the question I keep coming back to is, how much can you look at what the Eagles did this year and say that anyone else in the NFL can do that? Can the Eagles even do that again? It is hard to get that much talent onto one team, even when you're trying your best. Look at the Browns. The Browns are trying to pack talent onto their team as much as possible. They haven't gotten close to what the Eagles did this year on that playoff run. And it also makes me think about the Rams, man. The Rams played this Eagles team pretty close in the divisional round. And
Sure.
credit to Sean McVay there, but that's a big tangent. Let's wrap up the conversation as we wrap up our thoughts on the final game of the 2024 season coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sports book. And the Bengals, yes, I checked Super Bowl 60 odds, 24-1. The Bengals 24-1. So if you think that they're going to get the offseason right, that they're going to bolster their pass rush, keep their weapons, and put themselves in a position to make a run, it is in the Bay, by the way. San Francisco holding Super Bowl 60. Well, you can get in on the action right now. And it's not just NFL, of course, and NFL futures. The NBA is in full swing, and you can take advantage of FanDuel right now, where new customers get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA.
When you think about this Eagles team, James, and all of these things that we've talked about with how they pack talent onto the team, you've got first-round picks, Jordan Davis, Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith, Quinyon Mitchell. You've got a second-round pick, Cooper DeJean. They traded for Darius Slay. They get Milton Williams in the 3rd round. They get Moro Ojomo in the 7th round. And on the offensive side of the ball, you got a former first-round pick in Lane Johnson that they've kept in Philly for his entire career. Devontae Smith, a first-round pick that they just extended. Second-round picks, Cam Jurgens and Landon Dickerson on the interior of that offensive line. A former first-round pick that they reclaimed and brought back to where he thought his career should be in Mekhi Becton playing right guard. And obviously, former first-round pick, Saquon Barkley. I mean, the amount of second-round picks, Dallas Goedert, Jalen Hurts, that have developed for Philly. How much do you look at that and say, yeah, another team could take away from that? Obviously, there are individual bits and pieces and mentality and approaches that other teams could take. But I think even when you take that approach, this is really hard to do, what the Eagles managed to do this year.
Sure. The good news is, when you have, like, if you work with, let's say you get to 90% of the Eagles roster, talent-wise, but you have Joe Burrow, you feel great again, because the Bengals roster is not 90% of this Eagles roster, right? You'd feel really darn good, I would say, and you can find ways. And so I think the Eagles, it's not perfect. No roster is perfect, but it feels pretty close, right? That's not really what I'm looking at. I think that's really tough to do. It takes multiple off seasons. Doesn't mean you can't win the Super Bowl now. And I think the way to do that, it starts with, all right, well, keep your guys. Like, and we'll talk about alternative paths, but to me, it's really hard to see a scenario where this offense is just way better next year without T. Higgins. Maybe you could paint that picture, but it's hard for me to see it where they're way better and they don't take a step back. The pass rush, if the pass rush is so important, you take the guy that led the league in sacks and you take him off the defense, and then you use those resources elsewhere. Is the pass rush going to improve? Are they going to be the same and more promising for the future? The Bengals aren't building for the future. So I think that's where I would start, is it's like, make sure you get this offseason right. Add the pieces around the guys that you know can play. And then you're going to realize, oh, well, this is a weaker spot than we thought. Maybe we'll go make a deal at the deadline, which is something we saw the Bengals do. Aggressively address those weaknesses is something that's the thing they have to take from the Eagles, I hope, is 1, pay your guys. 2, all right, well, this is a clear need. Let's go trade for insert player A in early October, when we know that we need to address this area to make life easier, where we're not bringing in Lawrence Guy to help save the day when he's older than James Rapien and Jake Liscow of Locked On Bengals. No one older than us from now on, unless they're super productive like Calais Campbell or someone of that nature. How about that disclaimer, Jake?
And it's just going to get easier to keep the players younger than us the longer we keep doing this. This is not going to be a hard ask in a couple of years here. I think.
Don't mind me.
I mean, I'm older than you. I think aggressively, creatively, and redundantly attacking those weaknesses, right? The Eagles go and draft 2 corners with their first 2 picks. 2 of the best corners in the draft, by the way. Like 1 and 3, I think, on our draft board going into the draft based on analytics and film review and all this stuff. And they had just drafted Keely Ringo in the previous year. They kept Darius Slay on the roster. And they knew they needed to get better at corner. And so they attacked it twice with 2 premium picks in the draft, and they hit on both. Great. And they identified fallers, and they scooped them up, right? And they identified reclamation projects, which is something the Bengals had actually been pretty good at when they were going well in free agency. And Zach Bond, who played a phenomenal year for that defense. And on the offensive line, they have continued to invest resources, and they have a great offensive line coach, so that even when they do lose a guy, they have good depth on the offensive line. And then they go spend on stars that they think they can push their team to the next level. Saquon Barkley didn't have a big impact on the box score last night in that Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
Ran for 2-point-something yards per carry, 2.5 yards per carry in that ballpark. And as I told you before we started recording, if you told me before the game that Saquon was going to run for 2.5 yards per carry, I would have thought the Chiefs were winning that game 90% of the time.
Mm-hmm. But
the defense of that Eagles did so much to put the Eagles in scoring position with turnovers that it didn't really matter. And the mere existence of Saquon Barkley forces the Chiefs defense to play differently. And so you have all these different ways that you can attack the Chiefs defense if you're Kellen Moore calling that offense for the Eagles. So there's a lot there to take away. The importance of having a functional running game, certainly one of those things. The importance of building quality players at the top and aggressively going after them. The importance of building quality depth throughout your roster and not being afraid to continue to add. But again, I want to keep saying this. It's really hard to do it the way the Eagles have done it. The way they accumulate resources, the way that they manage the cap, the way that they trade around all the time to make sure they have resources. It's possible. Obviously, they've done it. Any team could have hypothetically done what the Eagles did here if they had the financial resources to do so. But it is hard. And so that's why you need to look at the approach and take what you can and then try to get some of those lessons incorporated in the way you do business with the specifics to your situation if you're the Bengals and use that to get better.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You have to. I think it's wild looking at, honestly, both of these teams and all of these guys that we had spent so much time on the pod at one point or another, the Creed Humphreys of the world, the Quinyon Mitchells of the world, heck, Joe Thuney once upon a time was this beloved Bengals free agent target, of course. Then it didn't even, I don't even think they were in the same galaxy as far as contracts go with what the Chiefs offered. But I push the envelope there, I think is the way to go. I think the Bengals, they like Creed Humphrey. I think they really like the idea of Joe Thuney. They like a lot of these guys. I also think when you mentioned Saquon and all of those things, I come back to it. I'm going to say it over and over and over and over and over again during draft season. I'm focused on players, not positions. Doesn't mean positional value doesn't matter, but you got to get it right. You got to get the right players. And would you rather have the right corner or a defensive tackle that needs 2 years and may turn out well, but may not? I would rather have the right corner. Not saying that the Bengals will take a corner in the first round. I'm saying that's where I would be focused and where they should be focused is getting the right fit and the right player that can make an impact right away. That's going to be a theme because they need impact players. Free agency, draft, a lot of these new faces that they add over the next few months, even if they do keep their stars, they need to be making an impact right away in September.
And I'm also looking at the impact of Al Golden here. They bring Vic Fangio into Philly. Vic Fangio obviously has a fantastic career behind him and is obviously one of the best defensive minds in the NFL. But the impact he made on the Eagles in that defense was massive. And the way that he got those guys to execute a game plan when he had 2 weeks to prepare for Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs was masterful. Not saying that Al Golden's going to be Vic Fangio, but the ability to develop guys, find roles for guys, maximize talent, it's also a big deal. And you can have major defensive turnarounds in 1 year when you get the right coaches in the building. And so if Al Golden is that, and he can make some of that impact that Vic Fangio and that defensive staff had in Philly, I think that's a big deal too. And extending your own guys early, something we've talked about a lot with the Eagles, talking about easy lessons you can take away. That's another big one too that we didn't really talk about as much in this episode that I wanted to throw in there at the end. Because getting out in front of it and taking those risks and being aggressive ultimately can save you money and can help you maximize your roster. And that's what the Eagles did so well to put together this dominant playoff run and a very lopsided Super Bowl that I don't think a lot of people saw coming and being quite that lopsided. And that's it. That's the 2024 season. Things will be different in 2025. We've got the combine coming up. We've got free agency after that, the draft after that. We've got a lot of time to talk about what the Bengals need to do this offseason. We've got to talk about the alternatives to just keeping their stars and just extending the guys they've got. That's something that we've talked about a lot and alluded to doing in the future. That'll come soon as well. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.